Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Unequal Voice, a conversation about why men outgive women in state elections and why women should give more. I'm Sanbonmatsu. I'm Senior Scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics. Thank you very much for joining our webinar. I want to welcome you all today. And before I forget, I want to thank my collaborator on this research, Dr. Claire Gothrow, who's Research Associate here at the Center for American Women in Politics. I want to thank Pivotal Ventures, an investment and incubation company founded by Melinda French Gates, for their support of this research. And I also want to thank OpenSecrets, our collaborator, for sharing their amazing data on money in politics with us. Before I introduce our illustrious panelists, I want to share a few slides from our most recent report. We're here to talk about donors, and what we're talking about today is primarily our latest report, the money raised for the state legislature. This is the third report in the CAWP series on women, money, and politics. We previously examined research on gubernatorial elections and statewide executive offices such as Attorney General and Secretary of State. And today we'll be focusing in on the state legislative races, and we're looking specifically at the 2020 election. What we find, I'm gonna get right to the chase, as you could tell from the title of the webinar, is that men drastically outgive women. We could think about who gives, the rate at which people contribute to politics, and whether contributors are more likely to be men or women. And we could think about the amount that's given, the total amount contributed in elections, and whether receipts are given by men or women. And so I want to share just a couple of slides before we turn to questions to our panelists, which is first looking at Democratic contributions. Who gave to Democrats in the 2020 state legislative elections? And we're focusing on the general election. We've broken races out by who was running in those elections. Are we looking at men versus men, women versus women, or a woman versus man race? And what we can see at the start of the bars here is that if you look at the first case, who gave to Democratic candidates when there were two men in the general election, the vast majority of contributors are men. So here is the gender gap in giving. But if we look across the races, the situation is a little bit different when we add a woman candidate to the situation. So in the other bars, when we're looking at state house or state senate, woman versus man or woman versus woman, we can see that women are doing much better as a share of donors. Now let's take a look at the Republicans. Here, what we see is that across the board, men contributors dominate who gives to Republican candidates. This is true in woman versus woman races, woman versus man races, and races with two men, although women do a little bit better if there's at least one woman in the race. And another way to think about who contributes to these races is to think about the share of receipts and who is providing the vast majority of receipts, the total money contributed. So let's take a look at that, bringing in candidate gender. And what we see is that Democratic women candidates really stand out. If you look at the dark blue bars, they jump out at you here. Women are about half of the money given to Democratic women candidates in woman versus man races. But what you can see is that across the board, that is not the norm. In all other cases, we can see that men are contributing the lion's share of money in state legislative races. Even if we're looking at who is giving to Democratic men, if we're looking at who's giving to Republican women, and to Republican men as well. So another way to think about this is if we just collapse all the money and ask across the 2020 elections, just who, if you pile all the money up and look at where it came from, did it come from women or men? What we learn is that men provided 68% of all of the money and women 32%. So let me give you that statistic again. Men provided 68% of the money to state legislative candidates and women just 32%. So this is a very large gender gap in who is giving to politics. And so we're very fortunate to be joined by 3 experts on this topic who I'll invite to join the webinar now, and they're going to help us make sense of this report. And I have questions for them, but I'm also going to invite the audience to pose questions in the chat, and we'll get to those in the Q&A. So let me invite them to turn their cameras on. Thank you so much for being here today. These are our experts. I'm going to go in alphabetical order to start. So Kimberly Peeler-Allen has been working at the intersection of race, gender, and politics for over 20 years. She is currently a visiting practitioner here at the center. She is a senior advisor to Attorney General Letitia James's campaign for governor of New York State. You probably know that she is co-founder of Higher Heights, the nation's leading organization dedicated to building Black women's collective political power. I also want to welcome Stacy Schuster, veteran political strategist and founding executive director of Women for a Stronger New Jersey. She's worked on dozens of campaigns at the federal, state, and local level. She was the chief political advisor and campaign manager to former Celgene CEO Bob Hugin in his bid for the US Senate. She's worked in higher education and has extensive experience with policy and advocacy work for nonprofits. And finally, Emilia Sykes, first elected to the Ohio House in 2014. She currently represents Ohio's 34th House District. She serves as minority leader of the Ohio House of Representatives. She was a member of the Democratic leadership before winning her election to be minority leader in 2019. And Leader Sykes advocates for job creation, education, and improved public health, as well as social justice issues. And her domestic violence work has earned bipartisan praise. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's great to see you all. I want to dive right in because I have these numbers and I'm really interested in where they come from because you have so much experience across this panel with campaign contributions. So let's start out with this, just the big question. In our reports, as well as research by other scholars, there is a significant gender gap in political giving. And it's surprising because women outvote men. Why do you think this is? Why are women so underrepresented as donors? Why don't I start? I'll go in the order of my Zoom room here with Leader Sykes. Could you start us out?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Kira, for your research and allowing us to have this conversation. I know it's one that we talk about quite often, personally and professionally, and so it's good to have it in an academic sphere. So one thing that is very interesting about that question and the premise that women outvote men but don't outdonate, and some of it, I imagine, has to do with the fact that the money in politics feels so gross, and some people just don't want to have anything to do with it. And for many women, making the decision to vote for their candidate rather than donate money feels like a better proposition and something that is much more impactful. But all of us know on this phone call that the people who raise the most money tend to be the ones who win the elections. And so we can't bifurcate those two actions as though one is much different. Obviously, the votes do make a significant difference rather than someone wins or not. But obviously, you get those votes based on your ability to tell people who you are and for them to recognize your name and then want to circle the box or however it is you do it in your state. One other quick thing I would just kind of like to notate as I was preparing for this was when you look at the top 3 occupations that political donors tend to be, they are doctors, lawyers, and executives and CEOs. And 1 in 3 women are lawyers in the legal field. 1 in 3 are doctors, and 1 in 10 are CEOs or business executives. So just by virtue of looking at the occupations of donors, with women being a smaller group of that, they tend to be, and it tracks based on your research and other anecdotal information, that there are fewer people, women, in the pool to be financial political donors. And then we see that played out practically when people like me decide to make those phone calls and raise those funds.
Great, thanks for getting us started. Stacy Schuster, what explains this gap?
Yeah, so I think I would just add to that. That's a great analysis of sort of who's typically asked. And I think historically, if you look just as in candidate cultivation with donor cultivation, women haven't been asked as often, and not as many women have been asked. So we can't really look at research that says, we asked 10 women and 1 gave, and we asked 10 and 7 gave. But you can look at donor history, and that's what candidates use when they jump in a race, right? They look at the people who have given and they call them, and then they ask them to talk to their friends. So I think a big part of it, and for organizations that are working with women and working to cultivate donors, I think there is a responsibility there too to ask people. It doesn't have to be a lot of money. It's about explaining to them what the impact of giving is, and then asking them to do it. And I don't know if it's fair to say that they don't give at the same level. Right now, they're not asked at the same level, and that's why they don't give. Or I should say, I don't think it's fair to say that the reason is because they're not interested or they don't want to. It's perhaps because they haven't been educated on the impact that it can have and how it affects which candidates, rise to the top, both winning and winning the primary to be part of the general election, but also explaining to them why and then asking. It's just a huge missing piece, I think.
So they outvote men, so they've got to be interested. There's your interest right there, just to echo your point. Kimberly Peeler-Allen, why don't women give more? Why are men outgiving women?
I mean, I think it is absolutely what my co-panelists have also said. And I spent the bulk of the first half of my career as a political fundraiser, and particularly working with women and candidates of color. And what we generally found was there was this, men have been, because they have been asked historically more frequently than women, and as Leader Sykes outlined the top professions of donors, there is a lot of kind of transactional politics that happens, and it's very clear of, I am investing in this person's leadership because it protects my interests or it advances my business interests, and that is a huge motivator for a lot of donors, and particularly a lot of male donors. And what we've also seen anecdotally, and I think there is some scholarship around this, the motivation for women to give is more ideological. It is more, I want to create a change in the world. I want to advance women's leadership. I want to fix something, rather than, something broader for the collective, rather than around their personal interest. And there is that differentiation in motivation, as well as, as we have seen, particularly in the Black community, there's statistics that say that Black women control 8 out of every $10 that is circulated in the Black community. And that is, everything from controlling the household checkbook to, investing in the community. And so, many women, I've been on the phone with them as donors, are saying, well, we've got X, Y, and Z coming up in terms of our household. I've dealt with candidates who talk themselves out of asking people for money because they know so-and-so's kid just went to college, or they're having financial difficulty in this way and that way, and rather than giving the opportunity for these donors to invest in the future of their community. So it is kind of a double-edged sword of both the motivation, as well as on the candidate side of basically talking themselves out of money before they've even gotten to the gate. So there's the gap is shrinking, as the data shows, particularly on the Democratic side, because of the work that has been done in many spaces to try and shift that motivation and really open up the ideology and open up the mindset of what you are investing in, and developing really a culture of, put together your political budget, talking to women about, shifting a pair of shoes annually towards political giving. So all of this is helping broaden and grow that number of women donors overall.
So they may not be giving because they're not asked as much. So I'm hearing that men are on the list. And so when we look at the list of who gives and who's habitual givers, we're looking at men, and then that kind of reproduces itself, and women are being left out. We started to talk a little bit about women of color. I want to push on that a little bit more. Other research by political scientists that looks at donors by gender and race. Our report focuses on donor gender, but those estimates about the intersection of gender and race find that women of color are particularly underrepresented as donors. And there, the gap between who votes and who gives is enormous. Any other thoughts on what might be going on there about why women of color especially are underrepresented as donors? And I'll just throw it open to anyone.
I think it has a lot to do with assumptions that are made about the capacity of women of color as donors. We know also historically the wealth gap between communities of color and white communities in this country, and what that has meant for disposable income. And so there are a lot of assumptions that are being made, and then the lack of connecting. It's not just a dollar that someone is giving to you. If they are a constituent, that is also a voter, that is also a volunteer, that is someone who can mobilize their network. So thinking about the totality of investment, whether it's dollars or human capital, that donors can provide, that women can provide, and through their organizing tactics, et cetera, that there's so much that's kind of left on the table because the assumptions of, just historically that, women of color don't give, or they don't give enough, or, it's not worth the time to cultivate and develop these relationships when you have men who are known entities. So it's, I think really just that, the time it has not been spent, or it has not been spent proportional to what the ultimate outcome could be. So there's a lot of work that can and should be done to grow the number of women of color who are donors. And I think the possibilities are endless.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Kimberly said. And to add, if I can, Black women especially, and I'll speak as a Black woman because that's where I have the most expertise in, we have been the lifeblood of partisan politics and have often been seen as super volunteers and supporters. And I recall even reading in Shirley Chisholm's autobiography about how she had this realization that at one point she was writing all the speeches. Why couldn't she be the state representative? And why couldn't she be the congressperson or the president? And so she just made that decision. And so I think that's what women of color generally have to do is show that we have been very much a part of the political landscape behind the scenes. And as we start to take our places as either candidates or as fundraisers or operatives, and we can decide also in those moments that we can also be donors. And just as we know that, and as we talked about earlier, donations are very important in helping candidates get their message out and introduce themselves to their voters, recognizing that is equally as important as our time, as our energy, as the letters that we write and the doors that we knock, and encouraging people to do that. And really, if I could just give another nod to what Kimberly said about the lack of investment that the traditional spaces have given to the works of women of color in trying to cultivate those relationships and understanding and educating why these make sense, that, your $10 donation will buy 10 packs of pens, and somebody's got to pay for them. And so thank you for that. And I think it's the reason why Higher Heights exists. I think it's why We Belong Here PAC exists. It's why there are many more groups who are starting to encourage these conversations, because there is an untapped potential. And once it is tapped, it'll certainly help to encourage and rise women of color to their rightful places in these spaces where decisions are being made.
Yeah, great points. And of course, another finding from our report, and I'm going to maybe put Stacy on the spot for this one. Republican women, Democratic women giving to Democratic women, they are doing well. They're about at parity. But when we look at the Republican side, it's a really different story. And I'm wondering what you think is happening there. I mean, this is larger than the gender gap, where women kind of tend to be a little bit more Democratic than men. We've got differences by party here that are larger than that. Why do you think women are especially underrepresented as contributors to Republicans?
If you look just generally in the space, women have been underrepresented on the Republican side as candidates as well in the past. We were sort of behind the curve on the Republican side on that movement, and in a lot of ways have picked up on what men in the Democrat Party had been doing for decades with groups like Emily's List. And I think that it's all in the same vein, in that there are certainly structural inequities, but there are also strategic gaps. And that's where organizations like Women for a Stronger New Jersey, which I work with, and Higher Heights can fill a void, in that there's a sustained effort, and it can be a sustained and deliberate effort, because campaigns, they move in cycles. And they have to hit the ground running, and they close up shop and they move on. So cultivating donors and bringing new folks into the process there, I think organizations are going to be better suited to do that than candidates or campaigns. And in that way, they can be really helpful to candidates and campaigns, and in helping bring more women into the fold that way. And the Democrat effort there was ahead of the Republican effort. We look to a lot of what was done there when we look for things with Women for a Stronger New Jersey that make sense to bring women into the fold there. So I think you'll see that gap close, as we've seen the gap in candidates running on our side has closed in the last few years. But it was definitely an effort that started from a little bit of a longer goal back.
So they got there first, basically. It's part of it, right?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I want to go back to actually where we started with Leader Sykes's initial comment about, what's at stake? Because I think it's obvious to us at the Center for American Women in Politics that when women are not, on an equal footing, this is problematic. But I think maybe it's worth just going a little deeper on what's at stake. And so Leader Sykes, you said at the beginning, it's very impactful to give, but people maybe are most likely to see that it's voting is impactful. So what are women missing out on potentially? In what ways might women's political influence in the states be hindered by this giving gender gap?
Well, women are absolutely hindered by not having a government that works for them because there is such inequity in its representation. So in Ohio, for example, women make up just over 50% or probably 51% of the state's population. But in the legislature, we only represent about 28% of the seats, and in our statewide offices, 0. And so that means that the people who are making decisions about the tampon tax or your child care or your reproductive rights or your ability to get an abortion are overwhelmingly male. And while our male counterparts sometimes hear us out, often if they are not living these experiences, it makes it a little bit more difficult. I think about my colleagues in Nevada who enjoy a female majority legislature. And when they started talking about these issues that were predominantly viewed as women's issues, although they are everyone's issues like paid family leave and such, they started to get those conversations going. And in speaking to the women who are leaders in those chambers, they said, it was just so much easier because you didn't have to have that 3-month-long conversation about why paid family leave makes such a good idea for not only the economy, but ensuring that women can be in the workforce and they're not taking on that primary caregiving role in being excluded from the workforce, which we now know post-COVID is a challenge with our economy and why we are seeing some of the problems we are right now. And so I could go and run down the list of the different policy issues that we just don't see. And even as I think about as a legislator and talking to my colleagues about what it's like as a woman or a Black woman or a young woman with 6 figures worth of student loan debt and a gender gap, and when am I ever going to pay back those loans? And how does that impact me buying a home? And what does that mean for my future? And that there are so many people like that in the state. It really would help our collective narrative, not only in terms of equity, in terms of a gender, but our economics. This is an incredible economic argument to ensure that we have equal representation, or at least close to it, by genders, because we all have to live under these rules. So I think it'd be more efficient. I find that my female colleagues and women colleagues are much more open to compromise. There's a lot less bravado and ego that walk into these rooms. We're very willing to get things done no matter who gets the credit. And I think everyone could benefit from that, especially if you take a look at some of our federal activities these days, although yesterday we had a good win. But those are few and far between because the atmosphere in these state legislatures are so toxic sometimes that we cannot get reasonable legislation passed, and it does not benefit people, and it's really undermining our economy and our ability to thrive.
Thank you. I think state politics are often overlooked, which was partly one of the reasons that we embarked on this research. Let me also get views on this from Kimberly and then Stacy. What might women be missing out on in the states with this gender giving gap?
I think it's an opportunity to help shape the narrative because we know, money provides the ability for candidates to get their message out, not just in terms of being able to uplift their individual candidacy, but also to advance particular issues that they are championing, and to be able to support women who are championing issues that you care about. They may or may not make it through to the election, but then the issue is now on the table, and we've seen that. I mean, the paid family leave has been something that has been championed by candidates, and particularly women candidates, for many years, and it wasn't until now, because it has been the constant drumbeat of whether or not these women won or lost. It was part of their platform that eventually it became more part of the national discourse to get to the point where we are now. So I think it is not just about advancing a particular candidate, but also advancing an issue and being able to, support candidates who share your values, whether they are male or female. I think it is critically important that women give to both men and women to make sure that they value the full, all of the people that they will represent, and make sure that those issues and those interests are properly represented by whoever wins that particular election. So I really see it as an opportunity to uplift. And also, break down some silos around what are traditionally, seen as women's issues of healthcare and education and family services. But criminal justice reform is a women's issue. Small business advancement is a women's issue. Veterans affairs are women's issues. And when we're able to have candidates, whether they are male or female, preferably female, to be able to really be in there and be in that fight, with that lived experience of walking as a woman in this country, it really helps advance the narrative. It advances the discussion, as Leader Sykes says. It really changes the discourse as you are debating these bills because you have that lived experience. So I think it's really there's just so much that can be broadened when women's voices, not just as voters, but also as donors and really investors in our democracy, is that they really take their proper place.
Yeah, and I don't have much to add to that. It is, the composition of a legislative body necessarily impacts the policies that it's going to put out there. And One of the things that we found is putting some of the women who were in there who could tell you what they brought to that discussion, what was lacking in that discussion, can explain that to voters so that they can, voters, potential investors, potential candidates, so that they can see why having their voice as part of that process really does make a difference, is important. And I think one of the other things that that Kimberly just touched on that is women's issues, and we have a separate set of issues that aren't relevant to everyone, because it suggests not just that the issues that are traditionally seen as women's issues are only relevant to women, but it also suggests that there are other issues out there that aren't relevant to us. And that's just not accurate. They'll take the economy out of that, but that is just as relevant to a woman who's voting or running for office or serving that it is to a man. So I think removing, I always take issue when I'm asked about women's issues with the idea that there's something separate that matters to me. And I think that there are a lot of organizations and candidates, and with women's voices having become a larger percentage of legislative bodies, we're moving away from that, but there are still some barriers that exist that suggest that we should be treated differently because we think differently. It's just not accurate.
So it sounds like regardless of what those issue positions are or the goals that an individual woman voter is interested in, the idea is that women's voices collectively are not being heard to the same extent. And so getting more women involved in the process as donors, not just as voters, might have a shift maybe in certain directions, but maybe we don't know, on state policies. So I want to move into the what can be done about it. And we've started talking about this a little bit already. I think we've talked about showing women the impact that they can have, that they're making an investment, maybe challenging candidates and organizations to think outside the box with regard to who can give. Are there any other ideas? What would you tell? Would you have a message for the political parties who might be listening in? Any other advice for candidates or organizations about how we can close the gender gap? Why don't I start with Stacy on that one?
I think making an ask is important, and asking people to be more thoughtful about who they ask, more deliberate about who they ask. But with political parties, I think they're going to, we found that if you believe party leaders pay attention to where money's coming from and where momentum is coming from, and I do, then the organizations that support female candidates financially and with grassroots support are going to make an impact there and are going to nudge or push people in that direction. And I think that's something our organizations are doing, and can continue to do at scale. One of the other things that I think Representative Leader Sykes mentioned early on is that women get involved in politics for different reasons, and we should think about them differently as donors for that reason. When we're talking to them about the impact that they can have and how their money is going to be spent, it's not as, and Kimberly, you mentioned this, it's not as transactional, and so there's not an implied, you're giving this to me to represent your interests, and I can skip over that and tell you what I need and why I'm going to win. There is talk about your why as a candidate. Or your why in supporting candidates, and then ask them to invest in helping you get your message out through a certain means. I think something more concrete. Those things tend to be to resonate more with women because they're seeing both the why and the impact that their contribution can have. And that's always been true with women's time, and I think it's likely true with their money as well.
Thanks, Stacy. Kimberly, did you want to add anything to this question? And we could also broaden this question out to think about how we can diversify that donor pool. How can we get more Republican women involved? How can we get more women from different racial, ethnic backgrounds involved?
Yeah, I think there is, really, just as Stacy said, making a deliberate effort to broaden the net, broaden the universe that you are pooling from, and then also don't marginalize or presuppose what people can and cannot do. One of the reasons that we founded Higher Heights 10 years ago was because we knew that there were women donors, Black women donors, who were not being asked to actually fulfill their full capacity. That they assumptions were made that they can only give this particular amount of money, or I don't know if they can really raise dollars, and so those assumptions had to be broken down, and Black women through Higher Heights and other channels have really been given the opportunity to show all that they can do. Looking at their networks and raising major contributions, and we saw this during the Obama campaign. We've seen it with Vice President Harris when she ran for Senate and for president, that there is a lot of capacity there. And I think fundraisers, candidates, party bosses need to really think long and hard about what the capacity of these women is, because I think we're really leaving a lot of dollars on the table because we're thinking in such traditionally patriarchal ways of, we need X number of checks, so we're going to call these guys and they're going to go out and get these checks. Where you have women who will say, you know what, I'm organizing my network. I have a girls group, and we meet monthly and we talk about X, Y, and Z issue, or we're all executives in the corporate space, and we use each other as a support network. And you know what? I can ask them and also get these max out checks. So I think it is really being purposeful of saying, let's look wider and let's ask people the open-ended question of what do you think you can do? Who do you know? How can you help us expand our network and advance this cause and invest in our community together, and really give people the option. I think so often, and I saw this as a fundraiser, that you would really, as I said earlier, talk your way out of a check by limiting or having your own thoughts about what people can do. And if you just leave it as an open-ended question and then let them tell you, there may be some awkward silences on the phone, but really give them the opportunity to say what their capacity is and their timeline of when they can do it, and really see the value in that. I know as filing deadlines and such come up, there is that sense of urgency, but it is that investment in time to cultivate those relationships so that when you're down to that filing deadline and you need to find that extra $10,000, you've already developed this relationship with these women who can get on the phone and have their friends or do it themselves to help close that gap. So it's really just changing the mindset of how we approach raising dollars in our campaigns, particularly at the state legislative level.
And I'll share a quick story of what happened in the 2020 election. There was a reporter who tweeted out a story that shared how Senator at the time, now Vice President Harris's sorority sisters, of which I'm a member, were donating $19.08 to her campaign. And there was just this story about how the fundraising team found this to be a very interesting fact. And a reporter here in Ohio reported out how that was weird. And so I corrected him and said, it's not weird. In fact, this is a group of women who have been historically involved in politics and civic engagement, and they found a candidate, a member of the sorority, found a way to let her know that they were donating, that her sisterhood was supporting her, and there's nothing weird or strange about it. But just the suggestion that when a bunch of women make a contribution to a campaign is weird just tells you everything that you need to know. And it just, doubles down on what the work that you've been doing, Kira, of when we even participate, when we have the nerve to participate as donors, people call us weird, and there was nothing weird about it. And thankfully, I've had to have a conversation multiple times, not only with the reporter, but with the editorial board about you cannot do these types of things because it chills people who would normally participate because you've called them weird. And as I identified, small donations were what spurred Bernie Sanders to stay in elections. And nobody said that was weird. That's how Pete Buttigieg was able to stay in the presidential campaign, even though he was polling at single-digit numbers. It was not weird when they were giving small donations to white males. Why was it weird when it was going towards a Black woman candidate? And so you can't frame things in that way and then pretend to be shocked and surprised when we finally decide to organize ourselves and start promoting and protecting and uplifting candidates that we want in the ways that we want to. And so that was a very interesting lesson for me, one I sort of took personally as a member of the sorority, but also as a Black woman who is always trying to find ways to engage people in this electoral process and not limit ourselves from these certain types of activities where we've often been told we don't belong. Those external voices do the same thing. And so even when we decide on our own we're going to do it, we're often told that it's not good enough, it's not right, you didn't do it the right way. But I would just say to folks who want to continue to persist, and whether your donation, of course, is a few dollars or it's a max out check, whatever that might be in your jurisdiction, those things are important. It is not weird. It is important. And it is an equally necessary part, whether you like it or not, of getting people elected here in our country.
That's a great story. I'm really glad you shared that with us. And it actually goes back to something that you said in your opening remarks about changing the norms, that we need to challenge the norms around gender and money and giving. And it's not helpful, I guess, if there is criticism when we're finally challenging that norm, because we need to disrupt those norms and make it easier and much more habitual for women to give to politics, and for everyone to understand and recognize women as donors, not just as voters. And we talked a little bit about how all this might affect women candidates. And of course, I'm at the center. We're always following the numbers about women candidates and office holders. And we do know that women are a record for women's state legislative office holding. Women are 31% of all state legislators, but there's a lot of room for growth there. We know that Democratic women outnumber Republican women in the legislatures, and we know that women of color are particularly underrepresented as state legislators. How do you see the relationship between these, I would call them missing women donors, and the situation for women candidates and office holders? Is there a connection there? And if so, do you think more women would be elected if more women donated? Kimberly, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I think so much of those numbers that you just ran through really go down to who determines viability and what makes up viability, and so much of that question is answered by how much a candidate is able to raise, and who, not necessarily who's giving to them, but do they have the resources that they need to be effective? Are they, as the report outlines, that 75% of the top fundraisers in an open seat win election. So there's definitely a correlation, but I think if we had more women, if we just grew the number of contributors and grew the size of those contributions, it would put women candidates more in a position of being seen as viable, because everything, I think, is still very much in a patriarchal level, and we're looking at women determining viability based off of the standard of white men, when we know that women organize differently. We know that the strengths of their campaigns are often, in addition to having the resources that they need, but also that network and how they organize their communities and mobilize their voters, that is a strength that is really in so many circles just absolutely invaluable. You can't put a dollar amount on having an active group of other women who are volunteering to support a candidate. So I think being able to make sure that they have the resources that they need to be effective, as well as changing the norms and the preconceptions of what viability really looks like, I think will increase the number of women in state legislative offices, and I think definitely increase the number of women of color, because we know that they campaign differently and their networks are able to mobilize in ways that are so often discounted, because we are used to this male-dominated model where you have your money, you do your mail, you do your ads, and you win the conversation in the chattering class, because it is a male-dominated space. And if we're able to try to really shift, not just in the resources that these women have, but also shift in the conversation about what leadership looks like and who makes a strong leader, and change what good leadership qualities, which are more often than not gendered towards more masculine traits, to more feminine traits of collaboration and consensus building, that really makes effective leadership, as well as some of those other traits. So really shifting the norms and shifting the narrative around leadership, the possibilities, the expansion of the value of women's leadership and women's political investment can be extremely effective in growing the number of women who are able to not just run, but win and lead at the state legislative level.
And if I could, just from a candidate viability standpoint, I know the organization that I work with, when we make that assessment, we're not looking at the same traditional things that someone else might be on the outside when they're assessing viability, because part of it is we want to come in and provide the support that is often lagging for women. And in doing so, the hope is that you're showing other organizations that there's a reason to pay attention here, but you're also taking an opportunity to elevate candidates who have a lot of potential, but haven't taken those first steps, or haven't, a lot of the time they're running against men who had a plan to run and lose a couple of times and build things up, or they've spent the last 20 years plotting that they're going to run for this office. And you found a candidate now who's running because they want to change something. They want to see something look different than it did before. And in elevating those candidates, we look at viability of the candidates who win the race, but we also look at, and I suspect Higher Heights does similarly, we look at the potential for that candidate to energize people. And even in some unwinnable races, if you looked at the math, we'll support candidates because we're showing that sort of that diversity exists and the candidates can do things. And we've supported candidates who aren't able to raise the same amount of money, at least not on their first go round. But they knock on 4 times as many doors as somebody else who was running for that office would have, and help candidates down ballot as a result. And now they're a more viable candidate, even though they lost, for another office. And so keeping their donors involved, keeping them involved, and keeping their message and their name out there so that they can run for an office that maybe is more winnable. We can help them do that. And that's something that, this is a stereotype, but men tend to do on their own. Just like they don't need to be asked to run, they didn't need somebody to sit down and map out a plan for them. They did it themselves. And so if we want to see that diversity that really changes the lens people govern through, there needs to be an intentional effort from organizations who are going to be in it for the long haul, and a cultivation of everything from candidates to donors.
Thanks, Stacy. And so this relationship between candidates and donors, if the women can vote a lot, but if the people they want can't get to run because they aren't perceived as viable, then the right to vote isn't going to be exercised in that case. So I think that these are some really interesting relationships. I want to move shortly into the question and answer and remind our audience that we do have the ability to take a few questions as we approach 3 o'clock. And before I do that, let me just ask, because this has come up a little bit already in the Q&A, about the wealth of candidates, and what would you tell women who, I guess we talked about this a little bit, do you have to, that you don't need the personal wealth to succeed, although it is hard to run against someone who is self-financing. This is one aspect of our report. Men are more likely than women to self-finance, and I'm just wondering if you have any other kind of comebacks to that concern out there among potential women candidates?
I'm happy to start because I am always actively recruiting candidates and encouraging women to run. And my advice is just do it. You'd be surprised that people will still like you and still want to vote for you and still support you when you put your name out there. In my first race, I was outspent 2-1 and I won 3-1. Certainly that is not what normally happens, but it does happen, especially when you find other ways to campaign, as Stacy and Kimberly said. Perhaps if the only metric that people were looking at, which some of them were, was how much money I was raising, and they counted me out in that way, but they didn't realize how many doors I had knocked and how many people I had been communicating with and how deep the connections I had with the community. Now, I will admit my family had been a political name there, as did my opponent, though. So we were kind of on a level playing field, but I ran against a older white male and I was a young Black woman. And literally the stack, even with that, was against me. I'll just share, if I can, Kira, just looking at some of the historical aspects of the giving in my campaign. And, 60% of my donors over the last 10 years essentially have been women. And I look at my counterpart, however, who the Senate minority leader, and 70% of men are his donors. Now, I've also looked interestingly at our Speaker of the House, but we are all, again, my asterisk here is not apples to apples. We are in a super minority as Democrats here. But even looking at my top 5 donors, the amounts that I received were much lower. Now, not significantly, we had about a $13,000 limit, but his top 5 donors were all max out checks, and mine were not. They were still 5 digits, but not max out checks. 3 of my top 5 donors were women. 0.5 of his top donors, that's because they categorize it as a couple, was a woman. So not even an entire woman in the top 5, giving history as the Speaker of the House with whom I compete. And here's the one thing that I think is very interesting. And I don't say this to be discouraging, but just to be realistic. Although I raised in the last cycle $100,000 less than the Republican, which is actually not too bad considering our numbers, I had 333 more unique donors. So even to get to that point, it just took me longer and I had to reach more people even still to get $100,000 less. And I know that is discouraging to people, but that also means that I've reached many, many more people in a very thoughtful way that, sometimes we just have to take the moral victories. And that is a moral victory that when I look at my nearly 1,000 and his just over 500, those are people who thought enough of my candidacy to want to invest. And so if we extrapolate that, and what does that mean if I, put that type of energy and time, that means election results start to change, not only for me, but people like me, and people can start to see someone who looks like me in a position as a state representative or state senator or minority leader or congressperson or vice president or even president of the United States one day. And so these are very important things that could and should happen, even though the numbers don't always look like what we would like them to. But I do want people to understand and be realistic about the challenges that we're expecting or what you will face. But at the end of the day, I just say, just do it. That is my advice all the time. Just do it. It is a whirlwind of a process, and I'm sure it'll not be like your male counterparts for better and for worse, but I assure you the better certainly outweighs the worse. And so I encourage everyone just to do it.
Great advice, very inspiring. Thanks for sharing that. And this actually leads me into, I'm going to segue right to a couple of questions I see in the Q&A, and we'll see how many we can get to today. But actually, we have someone writing in about running for office and wanting to run again. And this is a question really for Stacy. I'll read the question. As a conservative Black female Republican who has run for office and will run again, what resources are available? And so I'll throw that out to you, Stacy, and I'll mention that in the report we do have some data on the presence of women of color Republican candidates, and they are very few and far between, actually, and they're not running in the most competitive districts. So this is a interesting question that ties back to the report. Stacy, what resources would you direct this person to?
So, and it depends on where you are and what state you're in. In New Jersey, Women for a Stronger New Jersey is looking to part of our existence is that the Republican Party, we want the legislatures to reflect the people that they serve. And we want the Republican Party to reflect the people of the state as well. And our elected leaders don't always necessarily fit that bill. I know that's true in the Democrat Party as well. But so we're always looking for candidates who are interested in running and how we can help create a path for them. And then ultimately on the back end, we're an independent expenditure organization. So we can support financially at a point and not coordinate. So we're always looking for places we can link them up so that they have a support network on how to run and how to access resources within the party, although that isn't us necessarily. And so we've also been finding just through this process and through the work that we're doing, places in other states that are trying to do similar things. And I mentioned before that these Republican organizations that are set up to support women started, in some cases, decades after similar organizations that were set up on the Democrat side. So some of them are newer and not as well known. If you're on the Democrat side, Emily's List is easy to find. You know it's there, and you know that it helps candidates from the federal all the way down to the local level. Organizations gets a little bit more complex. So my organization supports state and local, but doesn't do any work with federal. There's an organization, Winning for Women, at the federal level that supports candidates only at the federal level. So there are a lot of resources out there, but a lot of them are newer and more difficult to find. I know that the Center for American Women in Politics actually keeps a list of these on their website. We've looked at them to find partners and see what other folks are doing on both sides of the aisle, which is a great resource. And maybe someone could put that in the chat and share that with the person asking our question here. I would also be happy to talk with you and find a place, depending on where you're running, where you can help find resources. Because at the end of the day, this is a personal thing, and finding people who are going to help connect dots it's really critical here. But CAWP resources are fabulous for that.
Great, and maybe we can drop our link in the chat as well to answer that question. And there was also a question about higher heights. Maybe we can put that link in the chat. And someone asked about whether we will be sharing a recording of this, and we absolutely will. There are a couple of questions about how to get women involved with specific messages, how to convince them, how to convince women who are, as we discussed earlier, balancing family budgets, or maybe they're single moms. How do we reach those folks? I was wondering, I'm going to put out a specific question, which is, would you mind sharing conversation starters to help educate our community on the impact of giving? For instance, before I became educated, I thought I could not afford to be a meaningful donor. Any conversation starters we could share with the audience?
Well, I always tell the story of my conversation with my mother. I spent 10, 12 years of my life as a political fundraiser. And I remember I was working with a candidate that she loved. It was like a second daughter to her. And I said, well, Mom, you should, make a contribution. And she said, well, I don't have money like that. And I said, well, you do have US currency, correct? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, every dollar matters and every dollar helps. She said, oh, I thought that I had to write a big check for it to make a difference. And I said, no, every contribution makes a difference, whether it is $1 or whether it is $10,000, it can and will make a difference. And what we have done, developed at Higher Heights is really trying to shift that narrative, because we have so many people who have said, oh, I just don't have those resources. And so we said, you know what, you can do it at whatever level you are comfortable, but you should invest, because of everything that we have talked about today about being able to help be part of the process and determine who our legislative leaders are. Because in some of these districts, if you make it out of the primary, you are basically given the seat in the general, because it's not a contested race, but the primary is the key part. But every dollar matters, whether you can give, and there's so many tools out there that allow you to give over a period of months. So is it $5 a month that you're giving? And that, I can tell you, having been both on the campaign side and in building an organization, when you know that you have reoccurring donations, you can plan your budget off of that. whatever that adds up to, that you have, we have $2,500 that's going to come in reoccurring giving every single month. You can plan, and that, running a campaign is basically running a small business. So you have all of the expenses, and being able to know that there is someone who is with you throughout the length of your campaign, with a small contribution that you can rely on, or maybe it's just a one-off contribution, but as Leader Sykes said, that it is an investment in your leadership, in the future of your community, and being able to say, we have X number of unique donors, and that number of unique donors who happen to live in the district are voters, are volunteers, are amplifiers, which is just so valuable. So every dollar, whatever you can do to invest. And we know that people are struggling right now as we all try to recover from COVID, but our political engagement is, I think, the imperative for it is just so high right now because the stakes are so important. And we know that in democratic participation, we are, on the lower end of the, global scale of how many people vote and participate in our democracy. And we need to do something about that, because a democracy only really functions if the electorate and the people participate fully.
Absolutely. And we're just about at time, but Leader Sykes or Stacy Schuster, last words on the conversation starter?
So I would just say it's really about being intentional. And if you can give an example of an impact that your donation made, so as a woman trying to raise money, having made a contribution and then being able to talk about it, I think is really helpful. One of the founders of our organization, Candy Strait, who some of you at the Center for American Women in Politics know well, she made it a point to make candidates ask her for money. So she was, I think, one of Susan Collins' first donors. She said, I have money for you. She had a political budget year she was going to spend, but I need you to ask me for it. And she would then call Susan Collins and ask her for things for other people. And she's done that with political candidates around the state of New Jersey, at least that I'm familiar with. And I come across these folks all the time who she said, I'm supporting this candidate. Here's why. She asked them for any amount of money that they could give. And she would then, that person use that same mechanism to raise money. You're almost teaching them in the way that you do it. And conditioning people to take that example and run with it.
And I'll just very briefly add, one thing I've also noticed is it's very challenging for some of the women candidates that I know to even make the ask, as Stacy said, and I've heard her say, and so spot on, we just don't even tend to ask women, and we're not tapping into that potential. And so one of the parts is just making the ask, but also what candidates could also do is make it easier for women candidates and candidates who've not been traditionally involved, is make it a different appeal. I know if I call this person on a donor history list and do a cold call and ask for this amount, they'll probably do it. But if I'm trying to get and elicit donations from a different group of people, I can't bring those same skills into this conversation. And so rather than framing it just, hi, I'm Emilia and I'm going to, run for office. Can you send me $5,000? Perhaps the ask is, I've got to buy 100 notebooks and 20 packs of pens. And if you can donate $50, that'll really help me get there, and make it much more tangible. And then it helps get people over that hump of, I have to be a multimillionaire or 100,000aire or whatever you are, that even your $5 donation makes a difference. I mean, I'll just, again, personally say that I have a former dance teacher who sends me a $5 donation every month. And every time I see the email, it makes me smile. When we did a mailer, I got a donation and it was just a couple of dollars from someone who wrote me a very kind note. And I knew that and still know that contribution meant the world to that person, that they took the effort to do it. And those are very meaningful. And so once we start to recognize how important these donations are, because when folks who do not traditionally give, it really means that they are inspired by our leadership. We should thank them and encourage people like them to engage, because we hear so much about the amount of money in politics and these large checks. And if more people were donating a little, it would eliminate the need for these super PAC, large donations that, again, make people's skin crawl when we're getting $5, $10, $25, even $100 from a lot more people rather than large 5- and 6-figure checks from just a few. It really feels like more people are part of the process and could probably help with just the way that people feel about political donations overall.
Thank you so much. I'm going to bring the conversation to a close because we're at time. This is a conversation that I've been really wanting to have for a long time, and you are the right people to move us forward and move the needle on this. So I thank you so much for the wisdom that you provided, and thank the audience for joining us. Thanks very much.